This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for August 13th, 2019, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, Chuckers.
We have a great show for you today. Adam is going to explore the likelihood that Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide.
That's right.
I'm going to give you a short book review of The Secret of Our Success. Not the Michael J. Fox movie. But first, Cristina is going to answer the question, does making the New York Times bestseller list require being a bestseller?
You'd think, right? I came across a cracked article titled 5 Official Sounding Measurements That Are Complete BS. It sounded fun. So it mentions the doomsday clock having zero scientific basis and the Scoville scale, which Pat talked about in a game of Name That. But the one that really piqued my interest was becoming a New York Times best-selling author doesn't require actually being a bestseller. Now, presumably you guys have heard of the New York Times bestseller list?
Of course.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all over book jackets to try to promote more sales of the book.
It is definitely great publicity, Adam, for whoever lands on that list. Now, a little bit of history according to its wiki. The New York Times bestseller list is, quote, widely considered the preeminent list of best-selling books in the United States.
Wow.
The bestseller list has been published in the Times since October 12th, 1931. Now, I can only compare it to my knowledge of how music industry charts work, which is a segment for another day. But I would expect that the New York Times bestseller list would be a strong indicator of, well, you know, book sales in the U.S., right?
I would hope they would at least correlate somewhat closely.
Now, the article goes on to cite a lawsuit in the 80s. William Peter Blatty wrote a sequel to The Exorcist and sold copious copies of it. Yet the paper didn't include it on its prestigious list. So Blatty sued them. And he lost because part of the Times' legal argument was that the list is not mathematically objective, but rather editorial content.
What? Wow.
Now, even though he lost, this drew attention to the question, how exactly is this so-called bestseller list compiled? And if it's not mathematically objective, how do they come up with it? So it didn't take me long to find an answer. New York Times has been criticized by everyone from authors to book industry execs to publishers for not disclosing how they come up with the list. For years, industry people have maintained that the method is less than scientific. So yes, the Times method is the P word, proprietary. The claim is that they take sales figures and other unpublished data and guidelines into account. So the way they arrive at the list is essentially a trade secret. I started having flashbacks of the J.D. Power Award. So this list is really more of a rough estimate. It relies on anticipated sales, the number of books ordered by certain brick-and-mortar bookstores before it's physically available.
Oh, wow. This sounds more like radio charts than book sales.
Well, if a bookstore anticipates a big seller, they will obviously order accordingly, right? They're going to order more books than they typically would. But just pointing out, in case you missed it, that means the list is not based on the actual number of books sold. So, which bookstores do they include? No idea. It's a secret. But as you can imagine, it has been top publishers' mandates to figure it out, and they have a pretty good idea of how to finesse onto that list now. And it's not shocking or coincidence that you may see many of the big publishers' books on the New York Times list all the time.
Does getting on that list include things like bringing someone to, like, sports games and buying them dinner and stuff like that? Or
No.
Okay.
Not from what I've read.
Okay.
But let me finish and then we can go back and address that.
Sure.
Just to be clear, these are legit bookstores selling these books. So if, and let's just take an example, Book City, and they order, 10,000 Michelle Obama, I mean, it's a small store, it would be maybe 500 Michelle Obama books because they anticipated selling out. New York Times list will presumably look at that and go, okay, so that should be on the bestseller list. But it hasn't sold those 500 copies yet. Okay, so that leads nicely into, I was really curious to how many books sold in a week at these mystery stores. So what do you guys think? Want to take a guess? In a week, how many books does it take to make that list?
Oh boy, it's probably a range of anything from like 200 to like 400,000.
I would assume it's over 1,000, but I'm suspicious that's the metric at all.
I would hope it's based on the size of the store and the location of it, but I bet you it's way lower than we think, just like record sales.
Well, industry insiders say it takes about 20,000 books ordered during a week to get a shot at making the list, which to me is really low when you look at Amazon and you see people who've sold, you know, a woman who was self-published who sold 1 million books on Amazon.
But that's 20,000 books across all the stores that they're tracking, correct?
Yeah, it's just 20,000 books ordered in that week, from what I understand.
Okay.
And to sort of corroborate that, a Fast Company article written by an author named Galen Gao says it seems low to authors like herself who have sold well over 20,000 books on Amazon.
Yeah.
So
I think that's, I'm going to call that into question just because it's hard to sell any books. And selling 20,000 books is actually a really significant thing, in my opinion, just because most people don't. A book sells 100,000 copies, it's amazing. 1 million copies, it's like in the far, far tail.
absolutely.
When I was looking at the Jordan Peterson stuff years ago, he wasn't on the list for a while, I believe. And you're like, why not?
Yeah.
And like, well, I guess you just didn't want him on the list. So that's when I learned, like, well, this has nothing to do with books sold, books ordered, trending, nothing. They just, you know, they had their preferences.
Well, he definitely wasn't stocked in the right stores because this writer, Amanda Hawking, who, I mean, she's famous for self-publishing and making millions. Like I said, she was nowhere near the New York Times radar, and she was selling over 1 million copies, which to your point, Darren, is significant.
But online sales not considered with the same weight on this list, so they just kind of went to the wayside. Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting. So essentially, as Gao nicely summarizes, quote, while it is wonderful and prestigious to be called a New York Times bestselling author, and I applaud any author who does become one, it doesn't mean that authors on other bestselling lists are not bestselling authors as well. It simply means their books did not ship enough or fast enough to one of the bookstores the New York Times pulls data from.
Now, I'm wondering if there's other factors that end up intentionally or not excluding books from this list. Like, you know, the Bible sells super well. I imagine it's not on the New York Times bestseller list because maybe it, you know, is sold through certain venues, or like school textbooks. There's got to be one that's sold so much that's got to outsell a lot of these books that are on this list, but it's not necessarily going to be sold at like some small bookstore in Manhattan somewhere like that, right?
Who's buying a
comic
Bible
book or something like that?
Can't you find a free Bible if you're looking for one? Someone they're around. I'm pretty sure someone will give one to you.
But someone at some point paid to have that book made or published or whatever, right?
Yes, I know. I'm being silly. Good point.
So my point just being, you know, there may be some unorthodox things that are considered books, but that you might not necessarily think really should be on that list because they're not really, you know, novels or some sort of book. And I don't know if that's maybe what they're trying to do.
I don't know what the definition. There's more than one list, by the way. They've expanded it to be fiction and this and this. So, okay, so now we have an idea that the definition of bestseller in this case is a bit sketchy. But let's presume for a moment that although proprietary, they do use some valid info to pick the books. I don't think they're looking into a crystal ball. I think they have some facts that they're probably using. But can the list still be manipulated by, say, authors? Let me tell you about a company named Result Source. They apparently help authors game the system and essentially buy a spot on the list without raising any suspicion. So to your point, Adam, it's not like they are greasing the guys who do the list. They've figured out a way to get on the list under people's radar. So here's an example. In 2012, a now disgraced pastor named Mark Driscoll and his wife paid $210,000 to place one of their Christian self-help books on the list. Their guidebook titled Real Marriage hit number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list in January 2012. Now, a Pathos article I linked to details how Driscoll hired a firm that, quote, used 1,000 different credit cards and thousands of individual names to drive Driscoll's marriage book onto the bestseller lists.
Sneaky.
So
Yes.
they're maybe doing something like, you know, let's say people working for this company have insider knowledge on, you know, maybe they used to work for for the company, and then they're pre-ordering through certain stores, which drives pre-order sales up or something like that. And is that maybe the kind of thing they're doing?
Are you asking me where they got the names?
No, I'm just wondering how they might have gamed it.
Well, I'll tell you, in this case,
Yeah.
he got his church, Mars Hill Church, to purchase 11,000 copies. The names were supplied by his church and the credit card numbers.
To be fair, I'm more inclined to buy this person's self-help book because they know what they're doing. like, let's be honest. There's a lot of ones who, well, the proof is in the pudding.
Yeah, there's probably some worldview clashing going on in this book, though.
Be open-minded, Adam. Be open-minded.
No.
So the podcast Darknet Diaries did a pretty deep dive on how people were gaming the iTunes top charts.
Yeah.
And he goes on to liken it to the New York Times bestseller list. So I would recommend that podcast if this
I
is...
love that podcast.
Yeah, if this is something of interest, he does a pretty good job. The deep dive that he does is companies, my recollection is in India, where they have thousands and thousands of iTunes accounts, and they're starting thousands of downloads on any given podcast for, I think it was nominal, like $50 or something. And so they were driving pretty much unknown podcasts to the top 10.
But yeah, it's like buying Instagram followers or clicks or whatever,
exactly,
right? It's just your basic scam.
Thanks, Cristina. And now we turn to Adam and Jeffrey Epstein and whether he committed suicide.
That's right, Darren. Jeffrey Epstein is an American financier who has been accused of, and in many cases convicted of, a number of sex crimes, including sex with underage girls and sex trafficking of girls, including some that were underage. He died last week on August 10th in his prison cell in Manhattan. The official story is that he committed suicide, which has been met with a great deal of skepticism by, well, it seems pretty much everybody. Alternatively, he would have been murdered by someone who was implicated by his sex trafficking. A number of high-profile people have been accused of having been involved as clients of the women he abused and made to work as prostitutes, including a former U.S. president. In addition to this, he had relationships with a number of prominent people in the world of politics and the entertainment industry. Now, the idea is that one of these people, fearing being implicated in something very damaging to their reputation and potentially destroying their professional lives and sending them to jail, would have killed him to avoid that outcome. People at all ends of the political spectrum are digging the murder idea because it would implicate their political enemies. Both the Clintons and current President Donald Trump are being thrown around as potential suspects, so obviously everyone thinks that's really juicy. Donald Trump actually made a public statement through his unprofessional Twitter account suggesting that the Clintons were behind the death.
How preposterous. Like, actually, it's not necessarily preposterous that they were actually behind it, but the fact that a sitting president said it about another one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So could a rich, powerful, and connected person have someone who is in prison killed? Probably. There is motive, and there is potentially the means, but is that enough? Now, it's really hard to gauge how likely this is because we don't have a lot of specifics to go on. Have any of these high-profile linked people actually murdered people before? How many of them are actually guilty of the crime and know they are and think that this could come forth, right? If they're guilty, how bad is it? It's all bad news, but there's a pretty big difference between the legal consequences and public reaction to having sex with a prostitute and having sex with an underage girl. Further, does such a potential murderer have a good reason to think that they're likely to be implicated and that killing Jeffrey Epstein could actually change that implication? Now, I don't know the answer to any of these questions, so I don't even know where to start in trying to gauge the feasibility of that question. This really isn't the point of my segment. I simply want us to consider this option as being a somewhat far-fetched option. Instead, I want to look at whether the suicide option is likely, because if it is, then we don't really need to come up with some other elaborate explanation.
At least until we have more information.
Yes.
Absolutely. There's an investigation, and what that investigation will turn up is important and should be followed through and should be considered, right? So there's a lot to consider here. Jeffrey Epstein is 66 years old, and if convicted of the charges against him, he would be looking at up to, that's a maximum, of 45 years in prison. So much to say, there wasn't much for him to look forward to if convicted, and he would possibly not have lived long enough to ever have been released from jail. Last month, Epstein appears to have made a suicide attempt. He was found on the floor with bruises on his neck. This resulted in him being put on suicide watch, which indicates that the prison staff did consider this to be a suicide attempt. Otherwise, they wouldn't have put him on watch. In a lot of the discussion about this case, it seems like the first suicide attempt isn't really questioned. And so I wonder if people actually accept that this man actually attempted suicide once. Is him succeeding sometime later so implausible?
That's a good point. I didn't really see people questioning that too much either.
Right. So if it's a murder plot, is the first attempt fake? And if it was, he could have spoken up about it, or who knows? Right?
I've heard the first attempt was fake.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
So some people would say that,
Yeah.
right? Now, Jeffrey Epstein was no longer on suicide watch when he died, leading many to find this suspicious. So what is suicide watch, and is it reasonable for an inmate such as Epstein to have been removed from it? Now, I don't have specifics of his case, but we can infer from other prisons what the likely protocols were. Now, I do have some specifics, but not all of them. Now, the main cause of suicide that a suicide watch is meant to prevent is hanging. This is the most common suicide method used in prisons, and was the case used in Epstein's supposed suicide. The inmate is put in an observation room in which there are no dangerous objects. So this could mean just a mattress on the floor. There could be more stuff, depends on the case. In some cases, the inmate will have an extra thick blanket, which can't be tied or torn into strips, so then can't be used for hanging. The inmate may have no clothes except a paper gown, and this depends. More dangerous items, which are routinely removed, include shoelaces, belts, neckties, bras, shoes, socks, suspenders, and bed sheets. So some of these aren't really around in prison at all, but they're much less likely in the suicide watch situation. As hangings require something to hang off of, the rooms are also designed not to have any protrusions from the ceiling walls or furniture, and 24-hour surveillance video is common. There's usually a routine person checking up to see if the inmate is alive. The frequency is dictated by the case, so this is usually every 15 to 30 minutes. Inmates at high risk may have constant supervision. So for the Metropolitan Correctional Center, where Epstein was being held, there are 5 holding cells in the psych unit. A person stands outside the cell watching through a window and noting any time they move, and this is done at least every 15 minutes. So the most amount of time that can go by without a check is 15 minutes in that case.
I thought it was 30 minutes in Epstein's case. Am I incorrect?
I read an article which mentioned someone who had previously worked at that facility that said that the checks were every 15 minutes.
Interesting. Okay.
That made
But
things may have changed.
It's also entirely reasonable. There will be conflicting accounts about what's going on in the situation.
Yeah. While staff will often be watching inmates, this will sometimes, as was sometimes the case at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, be done by other inmates. So a lot of people are questioning this and they think it's terrible. I've seen some other articles discuss the fact that if you have other inmates watching inmates, they may be able to talk them down better and have more empathy and things like that. There is a program, there is a protocol for them to go through, some training to have them do this sort of job.
So I'm not 100% sure of this, but just to the earlier point, I think the suicide watch was every 15 minutes, but because after he was taken off suicide watch, he was still in the special handling unit, it was 30-minute checks.
Yeah, that sounds plausible. Absolutely. Now, in some cases, patients may be restrained or sedated while under suicide watch. Jack Donson, who worked at the Bureau of Prisons, which oversees the prison Epstein was in, stated that most inmates at that prison would have been heavily sedated, so they pretty much sleep most of the time. Now, depending on the specifics for suicide watch, this can have the opposite effect of aggravating the inmate's distress due to potentially unsanitary conditions, as many toiletries could be considered hazardous, or just the fact that they're constantly monitored. It's because of these reasons and the cost of constant supervision that it simply isn't practical to have someone on 24-hour suicide watch for an extended period of time. Epstein's attempted suicide was 18 days earlier, and I saw one mention that it's rare to watch someone for more than 72 hours, though I don't know what the specific practices in this particular prison were. Was it really a bad move to remove him from suicide watch, or was this completely normal policy? Would being on suicide watch even have made a difference? Now, a study by the U.S. Marshals Service showed that 8% of suicides in prisons occurred while the inmates were actively on suicide watch.
I read that too.
Yeah. I think I read it in the article you sent me. Thanks, Cristina.
Yeah. Play along, Adam.
The flip side of this question, though, is that it might be easier to murder someone while they are not on suicide watch. I don't have those numbers. Now, the other issue to look at is rates of suicide in prison. Now, we don't have great data on suicides in federal prisons, but we can get a decent idea of their frequency by looking at state and local jails. For county jail, suicide rates in 2013 were 46 per 100,000, and in state jails, the number was lower, 13 per 100,000. So why is there a difference in what would explain those rates, and can that tell us anything? County jail is often for people who were recently taken into custody, and this was the case for Jeffrey Epstein, even though he was in a federal prison. He was not yet convicted, but a detainee. Detainees are 7 times more likely to commit suicide than convicted prisoners. Another statistic I saw, though I don't know of the reason, is that white inmates are more likely to commit suicide. From 2000 to 2002, white inmates were 6 times more likely than black inmates and 3 times more likely than Hispanic inmates to commit suicide in prison. Jeffrey Epstein was white. Now, I couldn't find any specific rates on suicides for those that had already attempted it, but this is a likely factor. The entire idea behind putting someone on suicide watch relates to the idea that someone who has attempted suicide is more likely to attempt again. This is a pretty basic concept. A side issue, which may or not be relevant here, is that sex offenders, pedophiles specifically, don't usually last very long in prison. Pedophiles are murdered by other inmates at a much higher rate than other inmates. The inmates look down on them. Were this the case with this particular death, it would also involve some sort of conspiracy because there was an attempt at a cover-up to make it appear like it was a suicide. So that doesn't kind of make everything okay. I don't think this is necessary either, but as motivations for murder go, this one might make sense and require some less complicated assumptions, implicating less people, and going further up the chain. Now, one other thing I just wanted to mention that I noticed after I prepared my segment, there are some rumors going around that there was a video camera that failed during the time that he committed suicide, and there's no source for this. Someone said it on Twitter. Seems like it wasn't backed up by anything, and it spread like wildfire. So when you see that, it sounds like, oh, this is absolutely a conspiracy, as if the camera just malfunctioned. Well, it looks like it probably didn't. So if it did, well, that's something that'll come up in the investigation, and we'll have to see. But it sounds like someone just kind of said that for no reason.
However, Adam, this might have come up after. This is the problem with a segment like this, because there's going to be new developments all the time. This may have come up after you wrote your segment, but late this afternoon it was announced that the warden and 2 employees who were working in the special handling unit the warden's been reassigned, and the 2 people working in the special handling unit have been put on administrative leave.
Ooh, so that could be, because there's something suspicious, or it could be damage control, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
Or
true.
both. I mean, there is something suspicious in the broad sense, and they also have to have some reaction. So
yeah,
this makes sense.
Well, and there's also the possibility that he attempted suicide, and some people just kind of, turned away and let it happen, and that doesn't need to implicate anything. Some big cabal of billionaires that did it, but maybe they just let it happen, So is it possible that a man who was in prison, potentially for the rest of his life, who tried to commit suicide 18 days earlier, and who was not on suicide watch, simply killed himself? This does not seem to be that improbable. Occam's razor tells us that the hypothesis relying on the fewest assumptions is the most likely to be correct. The suicide certainly fits, as there are quite a few assumptions, of which I could not tell you the likelihood, which one needs to make to determine that this was a murder. Not saying we can completely rule it out, but let's say suicide makes sense. An investigation will take place, as it absolutely should. If anything suspicious was at play, we can hope that it will turn up. If not, I'm just going to assume that Jeffrey Epstein hung himself, and you're free to think otherwise.
I find it interesting when situations occur and people think about the plausibility or likelihood of an event versus a non-event. And depending on the frame they inhabit, something seems like it is very likely. So here I actually have conflicting or competing intuitions.
Yeah.
It's sort of like when I watch Veep, if anyone watches that, all the people are incompetent. I'm like, that makes sense. Right? And when I watch House of Cards, I'm like, oh yeah, they're all strategic killers. That makes sense. And like, well, I don't know if they both can be true, but maybe. And in here, you're like, well, it is plausible. Someone could be left and this happens to occur. And yet there is this other world that I don't inhabit. There are assassins. They exist. People in power do try to kill other people that they don't want. This actually happens. You're like, well, if not him, who else then? Like, this is a great candidate for those types of people to try to get this thing done. But I don't know enough about the world, and it sounds like you're referencing a movie which sounds like Looney Tunes. But like, there are organizations and individuals where their entire livelihood is exactly this stuff. Yeah. I don't mean just Jason Bourne. So I'm not saying he was murdered. I'm not saying he was murdered, but it was aliens. Thanks, Adam. And now I thought I'd tell you about a book I read called The Secret of Our Success: How Culture is Driving Human Evolution, Domesticating Our Species, and Making Us Smarter. It came out in 2016 and is an excellent book by anthropologist Joseph Henrich. The book is filled with numerous interesting pieces of information. For example, the fact many quadrupeds can only run at several discrete speeds. They often pant when they're breathing, but when they're running, it collapses their sort of organs in a way that doesn't make them easily able to breathe in a certain way. Oh, wow. So only at certain speeds, if you picture your canter, your gallop, your trot, can they actually do it in a more effective way. While humans can run at continuous range of speeds. It's like, can you run slightly faster? Humans like, yeah, I guess so. When it doesn't really work that well for animals in terms of efficiency. Yeah. So humans have learned that they can actually pace at different times and change it up to then tire out the animal as they're hunting game down. That's like a little tidbit, just like, oh, that's a random fact. Or that babies can breathe and swallow at the same time, but adults cannot.
Makes sense with the bottle.
Sure. And then numerous things about different primates and different types of early humans and how our brains work and all that stuff. But the main thesis explores what makes humans so different from all their life on Earth. Mm-hmm. Many have tried to answer this question, and they often turn out to be wrong because they say something like, only humans can do X. Yeah. And then it turns out some other animal can do that too. You can have rough parallel. Well, machines will never be able to do this. And then it turns out they can, and they can beat us at chess, but never Go, and they can beat us at Go. And I just learned a month ago that they now have an algorithm which can take out Hold'em, Texas Hold'em. They beat 6 people.
Oh, cool.
Yep. Well, that's okay. What's left, right? It's like that, upside down archery where they use their feet. That said, I think one can argue that sometimes a difference of degree is so great that it is almost a difference of kind.
Yeah.
For example, yes, both humans and non-human primates use tools, but using a stick to get termites out of a hole does seem to be a different type of thing compared to putting a human on the moon and bringing them back to Earth. Yeah. Heinrich's proposed answer of why we're so different is cumulative cultural evolution. Why we are so impressive is because we have taught each other useful things over many generations. He does not mean the flawed notion of acquired characteristics. You work out a lot in your lifetime, you get stronger, your kids are stronger. No, we know it goes through the genes. But the fact that our brains and bodies have become better adapted to learning useful things about the environment into which we're born and the other life forms in it. So there's a subtle shift here. It's not the whole, nature versus nurture or genes versus environment. It's that your environment is shaping your brain and your body in sometimes a biological but not a genetic way. Quick example, if you're raised in an environment where you're taught to read, your brain will be very different than someone who never learns to read.
Sure.
That is not a genetic change. That is a biological change. That is a culturally driven, biological, non-genetic change. Somewhat similarly, you can have culture then driving this, and then the people who read might have certain advantages in terms of reproduction or general intelligence. And then they're going to have now a biological genetic advantage. So culture then can drive genetics in that way, as a rough, loose example. Mm-hmm. He generally says evolution is operating on the level of the gene, but one's cultural attainments can dramatically affect the likelihood of survival. And Slate Star Codex, which inspired me to read the book in the first place, did a great review, and I'm going to quote from that now. Heinrich wants to debunk, or at least clarify, a popular view where humans succeeded because of our raw intelligence. In this view, we are smart enough to invent neat tools that help us survive and adapt to unfamiliar environments. Against such theories, we can't actually do this. Heinrich walks the reader through many stories about European explorers marooned in unfamiliar environments. These explorers usually starve to death. They starve to death in the middle of endless plenty. Some of them were in the Arctic lands that the Inuit considered among their richest hunting grounds. Others were in jungles surrounded by edible plants and animals. One particularly unfortunate group was in Alabama and would have perished entirely if they hadn't been captured and enslaved by local Indians first. End quote. Can you make a fire? Can you keep a fire going for weeks or months? Would you know what foods you could eat in nature? You wouldn't unless someone told you, and they would probably have to show you repeatedly.
Google.
And perhaps yeah, exactly. I'll just Google how to make a fire. Communities have died out or lost abilities like making fire or making kayaks because they lost the skill and they couldn't figure it out again despite the fact that it would have been useful. So not only do you have European explorers near Inuit people who don't know that they can access all this food, you actually have various indigenous groups who used to have a skill, then like a lot of old people happen to die off, and then they just lost a skill. And they can't build better boats now because no one knows how to do it, and there you go. So everything is far less certain and likely and obvious about how you might do things. Mm-hmm. In fact, many food preparation or hunting practices involve many steps. If you look at it from the outside, because I've studied this, like, well, first you get this, and then you grind it a bit, and then maybe you put it in the ground for a few days, and then you mash it with this other thing, and then you do this other thing, and then you do this other thing. And you look for this like, is all this necessary? Because some of it seems like take a really long time. Yet, if you don't know exactly which one of those steps you can take out, you may end up making yourself sick or starving to death. So there's a reason for all these steps. Now, not everyone is actually valid, but the person who might challenge it might think they're doing the right thing, and then they end up dying later. So this is the idea of like, rationality is not necessarily selected for in our species, because if you question things in your local environment, not only would you might face social ostracism, why else ask those questions? Why can't you just follow along? Here's the 8 steps to make the food. But you may then actually do the wrong thing, although it feels like the right thing at the time, and make things much worse. So one quick example is if you're going to hunt caribou, a certain tribal community, actually it used to be in Canada off the coast, would use a caribou's shoulder blade, I believe, a bone, put over fire, and it's cracked in a certain way, and then those cracks act like a divination rod, which point to where they should hunt next. Now, to our rationality community, like, well, that's stupid. Why on earth would you do that? And then the good explanation in the book is like, well, if you're a caribou hunter, you want to find the place where the caribou are. And the caribou don't want to be hunted by you. So if you keep returning to the same place, the caribou will know that, and they will then pick another place to go. So one of your strategies might be best if you're randomly hunting.
Oh, wow.
And then it turns out this ritual, which has many steps, acts as something like rolling dice. And I'm like, oh, that's such a useful insight, right? You're like, oh, well, and then some guy's like, you know what? Your divination thing makes no sense. Why don't we do this? Like, well, how good are you at actually randomizing your hunting pattern? You might be tempted, like, well, there was caribou there last time. Let's go there again, which is the wrong strategy. Wow. So that's the sort of insights you get in the book. And you're like, okay, this works on a different level. Yeah. Another example is manioc, which is a tuber native to the Americas. It contains cyanide, and if you eat too much of it, you get cyanide poisoning. And here's a nice long quote from Henrich, which was also excerpted on the Slate Star Codex blog. In the Americas, where manioc was first domesticated, societies who have relied on bitter varieties for thousands of years show no evidence of chronic cyanide poisoning. In the Colombian Amazon, for example, indigenous Tucanoans use a multi-step, multi-day processing technique that involves scraping, grating, and finally washing the roots in order to separate the fiber, starch, and the liquid. Once separated, the liquid is boiled into a beverage, but the fiber and starch must then sit for 2 more days, and then they can be baked and eaten. It just sort of shows a figure that these different ratios are decreasing in poison over time.
Wow.
Such processing techniques are crucial for living in many parts of Amazonia, where other crops are difficult to cultivate and are often unproductive. However, despite their utility, one person would have a difficult time figuring out the detoxification technique. Consider the situation from the point of view of children and adolescents who are learning the techniques. They would have rarely, if ever, seen anyone get cyanide poisoning because the techniques work. And even if the processing was effective, such as the case of goiter, swollen necks, or neurological problems were common, it'd be hard to recognize the link between these chronic health issues and eating manioc. Most people would have eaten manioc for years with no apparent effects. Low cyanogenetic varieties are typically boiled, but boiling alone is insufficient to prevent the chronic conditions for bitter varieties. Boiling does, however, remove or reduce the bitter taste and prevent the acute symptoms, diarrhea, stomach troubles, and vomiting. So, if one did the common sense thing and just boiled the high cyanogenic manioc, everything would seem fine. Since that multi-step task of processing manioc is long, arduous, and boring, sticking with it is certainly non-intuitive. Tucanoan women spend about a quarter of their day detoxifying manioc, so this is a costly technique in the short term. Now consider what might result if a self-reliant Tucanoan mother decided to drop any seemingly unnecessary steps from the processing of her bitter manioc. She might critically examine the procedure handed down to her from earlier generations and conclude that the goal of the procedure is to remove the bitter taste. She might then experiment with alternative procedures by dropping some of the more labor-intensive or time-consuming steps. She'd find that with a shorter and much less labor-intensive process, she could remove the bitter taste. Adopting this easier protocol, she would have more time for other activities like caring for her children. Of course, years or decades later, family would begin to develop the symptoms of chronic cyanide poisoning. Wow. Thus, the unwillingness of this mother to take on faith the practices handed down to her from her earlier generations would result in sickness and early death for her members of her family. Individual learning does not pay here, and intuitions are misleading. The problem is that the steps in this procedure are causally opaque. An individual cannot readily infer their functions, interrelationships, or importance. The causal opacity of many cultural adaptations had a big impact on our psychology. Wait, maybe I'm wrong about manioc poisoning. Perhaps it's actually rather easy to individually figure out the detoxification steps for manioc. Fortunately, history has provided a test case. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Portuguese transported manioc from South America to West Africa for the first time. They did not, however, transport the age-old indigenous processing protocols or the underlying commitment to using these techniques. Because it is easy to plant and provides high yields in infertile or drought-prone areas, manioc spread rapidly across Africa and became a staple food for many populations. The processing techniques, however, were not readily or consistently regenerated. Even after hundreds of years, chronic cyanide poisoning remains a serious health problem in Africa.
Oh my God.
Detailed studies of local preparation techniques show that high levels of cyanide often remain and that many individuals carry low levels of cyanide in their blood and urine, which haven't yet manifested in symptoms. Wow. In some places, there's no processing at all, or sometimes the processing actually increases the cyanogenic content. On the positive side, some African groups have in fact culturally evolved effective processing techniques, but these techniques are spreading only slowly. So there you have why aren't people more rational? Why don't they do this? Yeah. Now you could imagine, as I was talking with my friends when we were talking this at my book group, it's almost like there's a desert, which if you can pass through, then you can become more efficient. Because now if we know all the steps and how it works, we can now then selectively remove the ones that we know truly don't work. Yeah. But how certain can you be? Maybe we actually think we're certain, and then 20, 30 years later, there's a problem. As I was reading this, I couldn't help but notice, is this what people who are dealing with vaccines think? Because they don't know people who are sick from them, they think it actually doesn't matter and it doesn't work. When there's a reason we do this, they're causally opaque to them because they don't understand how things work, and then they're going to make things worse and harm their family. So that's an excerpt, and a lot of the book has very interesting things like that. I thought it was great, it's informative, and there's much to reflect on. I'll admit I had the odd experience of not finding it compelling, in the sense I wasn't usually looking forward to picking it up, but whenever I did, I enjoyed what I was reading and thought it was very worthwhile. So all I have to say, I think it's very useful, very recommended for people interested in the whole cultural evolution stuff. I think this is an interesting, unique take that I hadn't seen that much of before, or he's pulled it together in a useful way. Thank you for joining us once again. Cristina explored the New York Times bestseller list and how they calculate bestseller in a certain way such that some actual bestsellers might be left off the list. Adam showed that Epstein was obviously murdered, and I gave you a book overview about The Secret of Our Success, which I highly recommend. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cute boys.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Oh, thanks.
I'm done, by the way.
Oh.
Well, I'd love to check out some New York Times bestseller lists, but
No, you just said you were done, and I was like, oh, okay. Because now we'll segue to something else.
We're recording a show.
Hey, it was like a 4-second lag.
Darren, you're losing your edge.
But I hate this show, but I like the outtakes, so...